It's March 30th, 1971, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
If you'd gone along to the opening of the very first Starbucks today in history in 1971, hoping to settle yourself into a comfy seat with a honey nougat macchiato, you would have been sorely disappointed because, although yes, this was a coffee shop, what was being sold wasn't hot and cold drinks, but whole coffee beans as well as tea and spices, and not a single white chocolate mocha frappuccino in sight.
Yeah, and this was taking place in Seattle at 2000 Western Avenue. Somewhat confusingly, the so-called original Starbucks store that you can still visit today is actually located at 1912 Pike Place, which is where they moved a few years later. And yeah, as you say, there were no seats because, of course, they didn't want you to sit down because it was a shop. They wanted you to buy your products and leave. And their very first customer was a supportive friend, Daniel Jack Chasen, who bought a few dollars worth of Sumatran coffee beans and was on his way, as they expected all of their customers to be.
The founders of Starbucks, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker, friends from the University of San Francisco, their personal interest was deep roasted coffee. The philosophy of the Dutch tea trader Alfred Peet, who you may have heard of, particularly if you're an American listener, because of Peet's Coffee, P-E-E-T. He had opened his first coffee shop in California in 1966 and inspired them with this belief that he'd promoted that there should be the shortest distance possible between the roaster and the customer. He's a sort of central figure in European-style coffee coming to America, actually, well before Starbucks. He'd inspired them, and they wanted people to be able to do as Alfred Peet does at home. Buy your beans, take them home, make good coffee at home. Nothing to do with what we think of as the coffee shop experience.
Yeah, and Peet also was kind of flying in the face of what the American market was doing at the time. It was still very much dominated by low-quality, mass-produced brands, and he had this different vision. He thought that coffee could be more than just the caffeinated pep that gets you up in the morning. It could be an artisanal product, as we've sort of all come to know it today, with rich, complex flavors and high-quality beans, and everyone could sit down and have a moment while they appreciated the tastes that were in their mouth as well as getting started on the day. But he actually came to mentor these three founders in the late 1960s because Baldwin, Siegel, and Bowker, they were all coffee enthusiasts, and they each independently found their way to Peet's shop in Berkeley. But there they had this quasi out-of-body experience, at least as they describe it today. Peet kind of took them under his wing and said, well, you know, if you're interested, then I will share my knowledge with you. And he taught them all about this stuff of selecting the best beans and subjecting them to proper roasting processes and how that would bring out the best flavor from each particular bean. And that mentorship was really pivotal in shaping their vision for what Starbucks certainly was at its opening, which was a shop that sold nice coffee beans.
Yeah, specifically they were selling Peet's coffee beans. They didn't have a lot of business experience between them, but of course they had enthusiasm and they had a very small amount of capital as well. They found a corner lot available on Western Avenue for $137.50 a week. Each of the three men also scraped together $1,500 to put into the venture, and they managed to secure a $5,000 bank loan. So they were open for business and they had a name.
Yeah, the name Starbucks, as I understand it, came out of Moby Dick, the novel, because they were also apparently considering Pequod was the other possible name for this venture, which just does not sound like where I want to go for a freshly brewed anything.
Yeah, it was drink a nice hot cup of Pequod. This is because I think Howard Schultz is the one who later told this story that they took it from Moby Dick, but Bowker says it was kind of a tangential connection. It's because Seattle, of course, has a huge maritime history, so it would make sense if it was inspired by Moby Dick.
And this first branch was on the waterfront, which actually the one you see now that supposedly the original Starbucks actually isn't.
Yeah, and of course they've got the mermaid logo, which was part of the original branding as well. So, you could see why it would all make sense. But apparently Bowker said they were just looking at old maps and looking at place names. They wanted something that began with St because they thought it would be a strong sounding name. They found a small mining town called Starbow, and that reminded him that there was a character in Moby Dick called Starbuck. And he said, why don't we do Starbucks?
Yeah, exactly. And the logo itself then was devised in this same brainstorming session alongside an artist, Terry Heckler. His eye had been caught by a siren, you know, the seductive twin-tailed mermaids from Greek mythology who entice passing sailors to their doom with their enchanting songs. And over the years, that he sort of like refined his vision because they all went, yeah, that sounds good. But the first logo, I don't know if you've seen it, it's quite sort of...
It's quite full
raunchy and wrong, like the
Starbucks with tits.
Yeah, the breasts are exposed.
A spread out fin.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's fins akimbo, isn't it?
It was 1971, you squares.
Everything started to change when Howard Schultz comes along. He's their marketing manager. And one day he was walking the streets of Milan for the very first time and immersing himself in the culture of Italian coffee and just had this sort of revelatory experience. He said later, the Italians had created the theatre, romance, art and magic of experiencing espresso. He said, I was overwhelmed with a gut instinct that this is what we should be doing. And the following year, he then convinced the founders that the coffee house concept would work and that could bring together these multiple interests of artsy, yuppie boomer types that were going to get into sitting down and having a sophisticated coffee experience rather than just getting their beans and going.
Well, to an extent, he persuaded them to add an espresso bar to their next downtown location, which was indeed very popular with office workers. But Baldwin and Bowker, Siegel had already cashed out by this point. They were not keen on making that the focus of the business. I just find it really funny that Schultz comes back from Milan. He's like, I've had this vision for Starbucks, you know, barista coffee on every American main street, Starbucks cups in every hand. And the board just said, ooh, no,
we just want to sell beans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was very much at odds with them. I wanted him to win them over with a big speech like a movie, but actually he just decided to leave Starbucks over this issue. He went away, founded his own coffee shop business for a few years, and eventually attracted enough investment interest that he could buy Bowker and Baldwin out of Starbucks and start enacting his own vision.
And then he merged the coffee shop that he'd created, which he'd called Il Giornale, after a newspaper in Italy, with Starbucks. I mean, he made a lot of savvy choices, but I do think the Starbucks brand name that he bought for $3.8 million is better than Il Giornale. I don't think Il Giornale would have taken over the world. But newspapers, of course, was one of the things that he introduced into every coffee shop. This idea that you would linger and read things and play games and listen to jazz justified then the premium price that he was putting on what is, after all, largely a cup of hot water and cream. Yeah. But he was able to charge huge amounts for this because he was offering what the urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg called third place. Not home, not work, somewhere in between, affordable-ish to everybody, somewhere you could go and sit. You know, like in Friends, it's the Central Perk thing, isn't it? We're coming up to that era. Sit for hours with your mates.
And also he profited from massive, quite rapid expansion because in the year that he bought Starbucks, 1987, he also opened the brand's first stores outside of Seattle, first in Waterfront Station in Vancouver, and then in Chicago. And by 1989, so just a couple of years later, there were 46 Starbucks locations across the Pacific Northwest and Midwest, and the company was roasting more than 2 million pounds. That's almost 1 million kilograms of coffee annually. And then in the 90s, then it began growing internationally as well.
Yeah, I mean, it started off in 1991. Starbucks arrived in California, and that's when things really took off, to the point that, you know, having a Starbucks cup in one hand was soon a classic accessory for any stereotype of, you know, a jumped-up twat from LA. You expect to see them clutching a Starbucks cup. You know, a Valley girl, you expect to see her with a Starbucks cup. And this is around the time when you watch, you know, like sitcoms and TV shows from that period, that early 90s period, you can see it in the way people say things like cappuccino and latte. There's like a sort of ooh, get you undertone to it, that it is something that's still a bit novel, because America obviously has a really strong, deep-rooted coffee culture and has done for a long time. Even during the Civil War, it was often said that both armies ran on coffee, but it was always the coffee that you'd call, you know, filter coffee. And that was the whole point. You know, when the founders started Starbucks, they were selling coffee that you would take the beans home and you would make it yourself at home, which obviously for the espresso-based coffees, you're not going to do. A barista has to make it for you. So it was this kind of big culture coffee clash. So they were selling Americans on the idea of fancy coffees, lattes, cappuccinos, macchiatos, etc. But then when they came to the UK, they also were trying to sell the UK that bit more just on the idea of coffee shops. There were coffee shops already. It wasn't a coffee wasteland. We already had Costa Coffee in the UK. We had Coffee Republic. Do you remember them?
I do.
But they were spread much more thinly than they are on the high street
because we had pubs,
today.
didn't we? We still had a pub culture in the UK then.
Yeah. They also have a significant revenue stream now, which has nothing to do with coffee. It's not even to do with tea. It's not to do with, cakes and sandwiches. There's a really good argument to be made, really interesting, that Starbucks functions as a bank also, and that's because of its
I thought you were going to say public toilet.
Right.
I mean, I've often gone in and spent £3.50 just so I can have a wee, but yeah.
That's true. That's more like blackmail.
That's more than spending a penny.
No, this is because of its customer gift cards and its store cards, right? So people will obviously gift cards to their friends, but they will also load money onto their store card. They're more confident doing this at Starbucks than they might be with other brands because there is this sense that Starbucks is going to be around forever.
Yeah.
It's not going to collapse. So as of 2024, Starbucks had almost $2 billion in unspent funds across those gift cards and store cards, right? This functions because obviously they know, they could study the patterns, they know how much of that, there's not going to be, it's not like a bank rush, there's not going to be a rush on the store cards. So this $2 billion functions as an interest-free loan, which it then invests and profits from.
God, imagine how much more money they'd have if students didn't steal all those mugs.
Yeah.
Now,
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/retrospectors